I'd love to see a child tax credit that's $5,000 per child, but you, of course, have to work with Congress to see how possible and viable that is.
We've raised concerns that Iranian cyber actors have been seeking to influence elections around the world.
And my opponent has probably the highest profile of all of the squad. The voters here in this district know who Don Samuels is.
Hello, I'm Caitlin Huey-Burns in Washington. Welcome to America Decides. Thanks for being with us. Vice President Kamala Harris and Governor Tim Walz's battleground state tour seems to be paying off in the polls. A New York Times Siena poll has the Democratic ticket leading in 3 key battleground states. She has a 4-point edge in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. Those are all states that Harris and Walz made stops in last week. And on the Republican side, former President Donald Trump will be looking for virtual eyes tonight. Trump is returning, at least for the moment, to do a new live interview Monday on X with its owner, Elon Musk. The platform, formerly known as Twitter, had banned the former president following the January 6th riot. His account was reinstated after Musk took over the platform in 2022. For more on all of this, Bob Costa and Weijia Jiang join us. Bob is with me here in studio, and Weijia is at the White House tonight. Thank you both for being here. Bob, I want to start with you. These poll numbers, Kamala Harris has a slight edge, but the margin of error is also 4 points in these polls. So we know this is going to be a tight race through the fall. But I'm curious what you make of this race, changing a bit.
It appears, based on this recent poll, that Vice President Harris is keeping together President Biden's coalition in the industrial Midwest and some of these other battleground states, but obviously exciting Democrats who might have been on the sidelines, or some traditional Republicans or non-voters who have been so far a little bit lax when it comes to engaging with this campaign.
And Weijia, I'm curious what you were hearing covering the Harris campaign, what they make of these numbers. I mean, last week you were telling us about how this is a campaign that sees themselves as the underdog.
And that's exactly what the vice president said during a rally over the weekend in Las Vegas. When this poll came out, she said, let's not pay too much attention to the polls because we know it's going to be very tight until the very end. And she said again during this huge rally that we still have a lot of work to do, because the concern is that all the momentum that we are seeing will start to dwindle. And obviously, she wants to remind people that there's still plenty of time left between now and November for things to change again, which is why they're not celebrating too much these polls. But internally, sources are, of course, excited. And, they say the reason it matters to them mostly is because it validates the change on the ticket, the top of the ticket, because Biden never had this kind of lead. So I think that's the reference point that they're looking at. Not exactly just Trump, but Harris v. Biden, showing that she is doing better than he ever was.
Yeah, and it's interesting, too, because the Trump campaign told us last week that their own internal numbers show that Kamala Harris has consolidated the Democratic base and has been successful in rallying the base. So that's a significant movement. Bob, you, Weijia, and I have all covered Donald Trump for a long time, and we know that Twitter, now known as X, is so a part of him. The idea that he is returning tonight to do this interview with Elon Musk on X, what does that say to you about kind of where this campaign is right now?
He is going back to a social media platform that was a huge help for his campaign in 2016 when he was just starting to enter presidential politics. His tweets drove the conversation in 2015 and 2016, helped him win the White House in the sense of providing him with his ability to, as he once told me, dive into the news cycle, to just kind of see what's happening, weigh in on it, offer commentary. And he's built his own Truth Social platform that has provided him with an ability to have this kind of long-form space to write mini essays and posts and sometimes screeds against his opponents. But by coming back to X, he's also aligning himself a little bit more with the Elon Musk orbit, which is a certain kind of conservative tilting person who's very plugged in with Silicon Valley technology and often Republican politics.
And Weija, I know you covered the Trump White House, so I know those late night tweets were part and parcel of everything you had to deal with covering the White House. But I also want to ask you about Harris and some policies she's been introducing. Because at a rally over the weekend, she said that her administration would get rid of tax on tips for service workers. I know today you asked the White House press secretary, Karine Jean-Pierre, about this. Of course, this was something that Trump announced that he would do a couple of months ago. What did she say? What did the White House say?
So the reason we are pressing on this, Caitlin, is because this is one of the first policy proposals that we have heard from Vice President Harris, along with raising minimum wage. As you mentioned, she says that she supports eliminating taxes on tips, which in Las Vegas, where she made this announcement, is a huge deal for the people who work in the service industry, in the restaurant industry. But as you mentioned, this is an idea that Trump rolled out in June, and he accused Harris of stealing it from her. In fact, he wrote on X, as Robert was just mentioning, about how she copied his idea. So we were trying to drill down on whether that was true or whether this was an organic idea of hers, something that she and President Biden have discussed before. So here's what she had to say.
Obviously it's a new idea. I'm just saying that we support it, but we have been doing the work, right, for hardworking Americans to lower cost. And that is something you're going to see that on Thursday with both the president and the vice president when they make an announcement on other ways or other additional ways to lower cost.
So before that, there were several other attempts to just try to get some clarity about whether this is an idea that the Biden-Harris administration had ever considered in the past 3.5 years. And you heard her say there that it's, in fact, a new idea. And the reason, again, why this matters is because we have heard very few ideas at all from the vice president about her plans to, increase, to help the U.S. economy.
Yeah, and we'll see if more rolls out over the next few days before the Democratic National Convention. Bob, meanwhile, J.D. Vance has been doing a lot of interviews, and he actually advocated for a policy that is more in line with what Democrats have proposed. Let's take a listen.
I think one of the things you can do is make it bigger per child. I think we'd love to see it at a higher dollar value. And again, President Trump and I have proposed that. I mean, look, I'd love to see a child tax credit that's $5,000 per child, but you, of course, have to work with Congress to see how possible and viable that is.
He's talking about a child tax credit. And again, all of these policies, we'll see whether a Congress can pass them. But what do you make of that? And also the idea that J.D. Vance was on all the Sunday shows this weekend trying to make a point.
It's a new point, but actually an old point from Senator J.D. Vance. He is wading into a debate inside the Republican Party about tax policy that's been going on for a long time. In fact, the first time I ever encountered J.D. Vance was he was a writer getting his kind of sea legs as a commentator over a decade ago, writing in conservative publications. And at that time, there was a debate over the child tax credit in the briefest possible terms. People like the Wall Street Journal editorial page, the editors there, oppose child tax credit on an ideological ground. They say that providing all of these tax credits crowds up tax policy, that tax policy should be clean cut, it should be rate driven, and should not be about credits for this group, credits for that group, because that, in their view, on a conservative movement level, leads to tax policy that's favorable towards certain constituencies rather than having a wholesale effect on the economy that's broader in how it's enacted by Congress and how it's interpreted and understood by taxpayers. Vance, though, is part of this group of conservatives who say we do need to encourage social policy and traditional family values as they see it through tax policy. So it's a melding of economic policy with social and ideological positioning that has really created a debate that's been over a decade plus in the conservative movement. Vance is definitely aligned with saying the only way for the Republican Party to expand its coalition is to bring in new families who might not have a political tilt toward the Republican Party. A tax credit's a way to kind of provide them an impetus to come in. For Trump, it's interesting because he's so aligned sometimes with the business wing, but he put on the ticket someone who is more willing to tinker and tweak tax policy.
Yeah, and we'll see if that has an appeal among those persuadable voters, particularly in the suburbs that both of these campaigns are trying to reach. A lot of policy discussion on this politics show, so we're glad to have both of you, Bob Costa and Weijia Jiang, to break it all down for us. Thank you so much. And a quick programming note, join us all next week starting at 5 p.m. Eastern for a special America Decides coverage of the Democratic National Convention live from Chicago. A lot has changed since Trump was last on Twitter, that platform with a new name and a new outspoken owner. A look at what we can expect from Elon Musk's one-on-one interview with the former president. You're streaming America Decides. And while Democrats drive the headlines, former President Donald Trump has been unusually quiet on the campaign trail. For the second week in a row, he has just one rally scheduled. But tonight, he'll speak with Elon Musk live on X. And here to talk more about that is Meredith McGraw. She's a national political correspondent at Politico and the author of Trump in Exile, an all-access account from behind the scenes at Mar-a-Lago as former President Donald Trump regrouped after his election defeat. Meredith, great to see you. Congratulations on the book. We have it here.
Thank you so much.
I know you have been covering Trump for a very long time, and I know you talk a little bit about this in the book, but it's interesting that he is returning to Twitter, now known as X, tonight to do this interview. And I'm wondering if you could kind of take us through what this platform means to Donald Trump and what you make of him doing this interview tonight on X.
Yeah, well, you know, when this book starts, it's right after January 6th. It's January 20th when Biden is being inaugurated on Capitol Hill and Donald Trump is flying down to Palm Beach. And it was really a low point for him. He had been banned from Twitter. He was off Facebook. His social media platforms were so critical to him and his, political capacity to speak to his supporters and get his message out, for better or for worse. There were a lot of advisors who were, frankly glad that he didn't have that platform because it could get him into a lot of hot water. But social media has been so essential for Trump. And one of the things that I go into in depth in this book is his creation of Truth Social. And he really felt burned by being pushed off those platforms and wanted to create his own kind of media empire. And so I sort of take readers behind the scenes onto how that was created, some of the pitfalls, the backstabbing, some of the drama behind the scenes too, as he built out that platform. But it really is interesting that he's doing this interview with Elon Musk on X tonight and that he has started posting again. He has 88 million followers on Twitter. It is a huge platform for him. And there has been some encouragement from people on the right who say he should be communicating more there and not on Truth Social, where he has a much smaller audience.
That's interesting. Yeah, we always used to say not everyone is on Twitter, so not everyone is
Twitter
on
isn't real life,
social.
right?
Yeah. So that's fascinating. Meredith, I was thinking a lot about this book because it does feel like Trump is in a vulnerable position right now. We were just talking about the polls that have come out. The Trump campaign is saying that this is a honeymoon period for Kamala Harris. They believe that the polls will kind of settle down a little bit. But it is striking that he has been in this position where, this whole campaign, he had been planning to run against Biden. You and I covered the Republican National Convention. They seemed, at a high. 3-ish weeks later, they're in a very different position. And I'm wondering, everything that you've reported in during that time of Trump in exile, if you're seeing any kind of similarities to what he's experiencing now.
Well, if you just think about the total 180 that the campaign seems to have taken in just the past few weeks, from the RNC, from that moment where he survived an assassination attempt. He saw the party rally around him once again, and Milwaukee was this moment of confidence for Trump and the party, especially with them thinking that they were going to be running against President Biden. And that was always what Trump believed would be the case when he was thinking about running again in 2024. He had a lot of frustrations about the economy, about how the Biden administration was handling the border, and especially Afghanistan. That was a really motivating moment for Trump in his decision to run again. And so for there to be such a change at the top of the ticket, it has really put them on the back foot. And Trump and his campaign still haven't figured out a way to message around Vice President Kamala Harris being at the top of the ticket. And, you know, I think they're looking at the polling that has Trump, you know, down in some cases in some states, and that hasn't been the case for much of the campaign. And so once again, they're at a moment where they're going to have to recalibrate and really figure out what their message is moving forward.
Yeah, and in times like these, you've always, you know, look to who's he's surrounding himself with. And an interesting person that you kind of profile in this book is Susie Wiles, who is a campaign manager for Donald Trump. Can you tell us a little bit more about her? I mean, she's not kind of out there in the way that his co-campaign chair, Chris LaCivita, is. She's much more reserved, but you cover kind of how she came up in politics.
Yeah. Susie Wiles really has been a critical force in Donald Trump's political comeback. I have a scene in there where back in February of 2021, when Trump was surrounded by very few people, she came to Mar-a-Lago and they had dinner, and Trump was asking her questions about how they won Florida. And she had been in charge of Florida for the campaign, and she walked him through all of the data. And she's been known to be very meticulous in how she, you know, takes notes and, you know, thinks about things. And she walked him through all of that. And just a few weeks later, Trump asked if she would come back on and if she would take over his operation and look at things like the fundraising, their political operation. And then since then, she's been really key to everything from the 2022 midterms, which of course were a mixed bag and criticized, and his 2024 announcement, but through the primaries and his takedown of DeSantis, and, you know, up until this moment. And she's been credited, along with Chris LaCivita, as giving a more professional, or giving Trump a more professional operation. They're longtime Republican operatives. But I think what's key to remember is there's the people that will surround Trump, and then there's Trump himself. And so as much as people can prescribe or give advice that he needs to be more disciplined, in the end, it all comes down to Trump.
Yeah, and I think last week was kind of a perfect example of this, where the campaign was saying, look, we want to focus on the economy, the border, Kamala Harris's record, and Trump gave a press conference when he talked about a lot of different things. And he's also been, you know, going after former rivals, you know, Brian Kemp, for example, at a recent rally. And I'm curious, you know, in all of your reporting covering him over the years, I mean, you kind of made this point, but at the end of the day, Trump is Trump and is not going to change.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why his base of supporters like him, and it's one of the reasons why there still are a lot of Republicans who are reluctant to get behind him and vote for him. And, you know, he is going to say whatever is on his mind, but, you know, you bring up his rivalry with Governor Kemp. You know, Georgia is going to be a really critical state in the upcoming election. We've seen how polling there has tightened. And when he was at a rally in Atlanta, the headlines afterwards weren't about his message to Georgia voters. They were all about his rivalry with Governor Kemp. So I think these moments where Donald Trump inserts himself and inserts his grievances or gripes or rivalries with people, it's going to continue to maybe give the campaign the headlines they probably don't want.
Well, we will, everyone should read this book to kind of understand this moment and moving forward as we cover this campaign. Meredith McGraw, thank you so much, and congratulations on the book. And we'll see you out on the campaign trail soon.
Thanks, Caitlin.
And new concerns surrounding election security as the Trump campaign claims it was recently hacked. Why they're blaming Iran for the data breach. You're streaming America Decides. There are new concerns surrounding election security. Over the weekend, the Trump campaign claimed it was recently hacked, and it's blaming, without evidence, Iran for the data breach. CBS News confirms the FBI is investigating the hack. Nicole Skanga joins me now to discuss more of this. Okay, so what exactly do we know about what happened here?
Yeah, Caitlin, here we go again. For the third consecutive campaign cycle, we are seeing foreign hacking campaigns of presidential campaigns. This time we're talking about Iran. In the past, we've talked about Russia sort of getting the ball rolling.
Yeah.
Our viewers might recall that on Friday, CBS News had reported about a report that Microsoft put out revealing influence campaigns by Iran, as well as the malicious targeting of a presidential campaign. And in this report, Microsoft says that in June of this year, a group called Mint Sandstorm, it's a group run by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Intelligence Unit, sent a spear phishing email to a high-ranking official of a presidential campaign from a compromised email account of a former senior advisor. And so as we understand it, they gained access to a former senior advisor's campaign email and were able to send an email to a current advisor with some sort of phishing hyperlink that directed that current advisor to a domain controlled by this malicious group. Now, spear phishing is a pretty common tactic.
Yeah.
It tricks victims into sharing sensitive information because it looks like that email comes from a trusted source instead of from a malicious cyber criminal. Now, the report that Microsoft put out did not specify which presidential campaign we were talking about. But a day later, on Saturday, the Trump campaign came out and said, hello, it is us. They put out a statement. Stephen Chung, who's the campaign spokesperson, said, quote, these documents were obtained illegally from foreign sources hostile to the U.S., intended to interfere with the 2024 election and sow chaos throughout our democratic process. Okay, to make matters even more complicated, some news organizations, including Politico, which first reached out to the Trump campaign, said we received some of these leaked documents. So that prompted this statement from the Trump campaign. We should note that CBS News has not independently confirmed the interference by Iranian actors, but we are piecing together all of this, connecting the dots, and continue to press the federal government for more information.
All right. And do we know what the U.S. government has been saying, just quickly?
The FBI says that it is investigating. It is looking into this matter. They have not attributed this attack of the Trump campaign to Iran explicitly, but we expect to hear more. The White House and the State Department deferring to the Department of Justice.
All right. And I know you will be following all of these iterations for us in a wild news cycle that's getting even wilder. Nicole Skanga, thank you very much. And are we in the Harris campaign honeymoon phase, or could the Democratic ticket surge be here to stay? Our political panel weighs in on the new campaign's energy. You're streaming America Decides. Influential radio host Charlamagne The God regularly said that President Biden didn't have what it took to energize voters heading into November. He has a very different look on Vice President Kamala Harris, arguing that her surge may be more than a honeymoon phase.
Even if you're not a Democrat, if you're an independent, you know, or undecided person, you haven't been energized for something in a long time. The last time we felt energy in a campaign was 2008, when President Barack Obama first ran. This feels like, whoa.
So let's bring in our esteemed political panel, Jasmine Wright and Deepa Shivram. Jasmine is politics reporter for Notice, and Deepa is White House correspondent for NPR. Great to see both of you. I know you also covered Kamala Harris's presidential campaign all the way back in 2019, so you guys are the experts here. So this idea of Harris having a honeymoon phase, last week, the Trump campaign was calling it that, saying that it will dissipate. But we have seen in these polls that she has, at least at this point, consolidated, it seems, the Democratic Party base. I know you both have been covering her. Jasmine, I want to start with you. Are you surprised by any of that? And I'm also curious whether you've seen a different kind of Kamala Harris than we all covered in 2019.
Yeah, I'll just say I'm absolutely surprised by a lot of what we're seeing. Her very kind of impressive and swift consolidation of the Democratic Party. For those who were with us in 2019, I mean, I just don't know how you could have seen this happening. Yeah. And for those who covered her at her time at the White House. She is somebody who was often ridiculed, often a lot of folks considered to be not up to par with being the vice president, certainly not up to par with being the leader of the party. But here she is now, I think, kind of looking at some of those people and smirking in her very prosecutorial way. And I think that you're also absolutely seeing a much different Kamala Harris than you saw in 2019. I mean, what the people that she's been able to put in place, even though she's only been at the top ticket for 3 weeks. The lack of infighting that's been there, the lack of kind of almost seamless transition in a lot of ways to being the top of the ticket. I mean, I think that's something that even I think she in 2019 would be kind of surprised by.
Yeah, and Deepa, I mean, you cover this White House as well. You know, it was just 3 weeks ago that this all changed, which feels like a lifetime ago. I'm curious, you know, what you've witnessed and in terms of your own reporting about, you know, whether this is, you know, she has a campaign infrastructure in the Biden campaign, so it seems like she was able to just adapt that. But any differences that you've seen in terms of how she was in the White House versus how she's campaigning now?
Yeah, I mean, I think the timeline here is really working in Kamala Harris's favor, right? Like, all of us are whipping back and forth and being like 3 weeks feels like 3 years, but this is where Kamala Harris really digs in. And if you talk to people who've worked with her in the past, you talk to people who work with her now, one thing you will consistently hear is Kamala Harris is good in the clutch. In a crisis, this is where she, when her back is up against the wall, this is where she levels and is able to get it done. And that's what we've seen in the last 3 weeks is, you know, that wasn't the kind of Harris that you saw in the White House the last 4 years because there wasn't that need and that space for her. That's certainly not what we saw in 2019. In this moment, this is where, you know, it's kind of her time to take control and have that lane that is wide open for her. And she's really been able to lean in on that.
Yeah, and it's interesting because she's campaigning as if she is independent of this administration, right? She is the sitting vice president.
Right.
And the Trump campaign has been arguing that this is, in their view, the Harris administration, right? They're trying to put everything that Biden, all of his vulnerabilities in terms of policy, onto Harris. Have you seen any attempts from Harris to distance herself from Biden?
I don't think that she's particularly distancing herself from Biden, but I think that she is distancing herself from being an incumbent, right? Like she keeps saying that she is the underdog in this race. She wants Democrats to act like they are on the back foot, that they need to be aggressive and on the attack. And I think that you're going to start to see her not distance herself, but certainly differentiate herself from from the current president and his economy. We know that she's going to roll out her economic policy this week. That'll have distinctive pieces of the vice president in it. Particularly, I think we can expect to see a lot on the care economy, something that she talked about a lot about in 2019. We've seen her come out kind of bullish on immigration, knowing that that is a sore spot for her, knowing that's something that Republicans are going to continue to attack on her. So I think you're going to see small little differences, but not necessarily distance from this administration.
And it's also like she's bringing herself and her own experiences into it, right? Which are just notably different than the way someone like Joe Biden grew up, someone that's very different than the way Donald Trump goes about looking at things. And so you're seeing maybe not the policy and the legislation proposals looking hugely different than what you know Joe Biden would put forward, but her touch on it and her perspective on it and her language on it is going to be a little different.
Because for a lot of people, it sounds different. I think that's one thing when you talk to people, both close to the vice president, people who are also just hearing the vice president, that even if her and President Joe Biden could say the same thing, it would sound differently coming from her. And I think that that's what you're going to see in the next few weeks.
I mean, one of the issues that I'm thinking about is the issue of abortion, right?
Exactly.
I mean, this was a word that President Biden doesn't like to say. He talks about reproductive rights, but doesn't actually say the word. Deepa, I'm curious, you know, Donald Trump last week said that abortion is not as big of an issue as it used to be. But how does she bring this kind of more to the forefront than it was before?
I mean, she talks, this is where the prosecutor stuff really comes in hot, right? Like, and this is what's so weird, I think, for Jasmine and I, that this was something that she tried to argue with in 2019, and it didn't really, you know, go with voters. And now it's really where people are saying, I want the prosecutor to take down someone like Donald Trump. And the issue of abortion is where that really, really comes in front and center. And again, going back to that point about her own experiences, one thing you hear the VP talking about again and again is her friend from high school, who she says was being molested by her stepdad and then went to come and live with Kamala Harris and her family. And so Kamala Harris talks about how that was like this big moment for her to go and fight for women, to go and fight for children and fight for families and protecting themselves and making their own decisions about their own body. So she's bringing a perspective here that we certainly didn't get with Joe Biden, and you wouldn't really be hearing, quite frankly, from any male politician. And it just comes across a lot stronger from her.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see, too. I mean, the Democratic National Convention is next week. this will be, basically her introduction to the country as the Democratic nominee. Have you heard anything about what's being planned in terms of maybe her speech or others that we're going to hear from?
Well, I think we're starting to see kind of the speakers list drip, drip, drip out. Obviously, you're going to have your major Democratic players, President Obama, President Biden, President Bill Clinton, et cetera. But I think from her, you're going to hear a lot of her personal story, right? How she came to this position, how she came to be, how she came to fight in the way that she's fighting. But I think you'll also hear her vision for America, because that is something that this campaign is focused on, not just what's in the past, aka former President Donald Trump, but what Democrats want to do in the future.
Yeah. All right, well, we will stay tuned. 80-ish or so days to go. Anything could happen between now and then.
Anything.
Jeepa, Jasmine, thank you so much for your time and reporting. We'll talk to you a lot over the next couple of months. Let's turn now, though, to the Middle East, because right now, Israel is bracing for a potential attack from Iran. CBS News foreign correspondent Deborah Patta joins us now from Tel Aviv. Deborah, it's good to see you. So there are reports suggesting a retaliatory attack from Iran or Hezbollah. That could happen in the next few days. What are you hearing?
Well, Caitlin, this region has essentially been on high alert for nearly 2 weeks since Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh was assassinated in Tehran. We've heard constant threats from senior Iranian political or military officials vowing to punish Israel. There have been a series of military exercises conducted by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. Airlines have rescheduled flights, and Israelis have been left feeling very anxious about what retaliation might mean, but with very few clues as to exactly how or when that will come. And that, of course, may be exactly what Iran wants, to create some kind of psychological terror where the fear of waiting is sometimes more terrifying than the actual event. Today, White House National Security spokesman John Kirby said the U.S. shares Israel's expectation that an attack could occur this week. But again, we have been hearing that there could be an attack for a while now. And U.S. officials have also told CBS News that a limited attack from both Hezbollah and Iran could come with little to no warning. Caitlin?
And Deborah, at the same time, there are these negotiations for a ceasefire and hostage deal happening. What is the latest with those negotiations?
Well, Caitlin, there's a flurry of diplomatic activity, mostly aimed at de-escalation. Everyone talks about it, but neither side seems prepared to take that first step. And part of that de-escalation is the hope that a new round of negotiations for a hostage and ceasefire deal supposed to take place later this week could help ease tensions. But it's more than 10 months into this war, I should point out. And apart from the release of some hostages in November last year, there has been no progress in this regard. Hamas wants to only talk about the deal that was on the table in July, put forward by President Biden, which they say they agreed to. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu added 2 more conditions to the deal, which were not agreed to in July. And the hostage families who have agonized, waited, marched, campaigned, pleaded for the release of their loved ones in Gaza are still really no closer to bringing them back home as things stand right now. So until there is an actual deal that is signed by both parties and we see hostages being released, we have to assume that things remain the status quo.
All right, well, Deborah Patta, we always all follow your great reporting, and we thank you so much for bringing it to us. And he's a former tech investor and venture capitalist. So why does J.D. Vance support a big antitrust crackdown? We'll hear from the candidate himself. That's next. You're streaming America Decides. Well, it's been a tough summer of primaries for the progressive House members who call themselves the Squad. And tomorrow, another is facing a challenge at the ballot box. This time, it's Minnesota's Ilhan Omar. Our Nicole Killian spoke to her challenger, Don Samuels, and she joins us now. Nicole, good to see you. So you spoke to Omar's opponent. How does he feel about this primary that will happen tomorrow?
Yeah, well, keep in mind, Caitlin, this is a rematch. He squared off against Ilhan Omar back in 2022 and narrowly almost beat her, but fell shy of about 2,500 votes. So that being said, he feels like he has another shot to try again to potentially unseat her, although for the most part she has largely outspent him. And contrary to other squad fights that we have seen, for instance, in the case of Jamal Bowman, who was defeated earlier this summer, and Cori Bush, who was defeated last week, we saw millions of dollars being poured into both of those races, primarily from a number of pro-Israeli groups and PACs like United Democracy Project. That is not the case in this race. And I asked Samuels about why that money may not be a factor in his race this time around. Take a listen.
Why don't you think you're getting those same dollars?
It's a little bit of a mystery, and I could speculate. But one thing I do know is that my profile as a on the ground, day-to-day, studious and effective, pragmatic, progressive Democrat doesn't have the kind of drama around it that other races might have. And my opponent has probably the highest profile of all of the squad. So she seems to be impervious and unbeatable. And that kind of has been sold as a truth to the funding community and the national community. But the voters here in this district know who Don Samuels is.
And the Minnesota Congressman Ilhan Omar countered by saying that she is feeling very excited about her chances to win on Tuesday. In Minnesota, we believe in the power of organizing for our progressive values. That is why I'm fighting for the values of the fifth district. So Congresswoman Omar also feeling relatively confident going into this race that she can win another term despite what happened to some of her other fellow squad colleagues earlier this summer. Caitlin.
Yeah, we'll see if she can break that losing streak that we've seen over the past couple of weeks. Nicole Killian, great interview. Thank you so much for bringing it to us. And J.D. Vance made his mark across the Sunday shows this past weekend, looking to go after the Harris-Walz ticket. While speaking to our Margaret Brennan, they discussed a matter that he and the current administration can agree on: antitrust reform.
You're one of the few Republican supporters of antitrust reform.
Yeah.
Which has actually been a cause the Biden administration, the Biden-Harris administration, has taken up here, trying to block mergers and ramp up antitrust. You said of FTC Commissioner Lina Khan, she's done a pretty good job.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that? If you're in office, you're going to go after trying to break up Google, trying to break up Microsoft. What does that mean?
Well, look, I don't agree with Lina Khan on every issue, to be clear, but I think that she's been very smart about trying to go after some of these big tech companies that monopolize what we're allowed to say in our own country. I don't want a billionaire.
Which companies?
I don't want Google or a billionaire that controls Google that's in bed with China to be able to censor American information, and that's exactly what they've done. I think these companies are too big, too powerful.
And he's a huge supporter of your movement.
But he does not
and he does
censor.
so much business with China.
One, he does not censor, and two, he does not have a monopoly over free speech in a way that Google has a much, much bigger company, a much more powerful control. And by the way, the presidency that started the antitrust lawsuit against Google was Donald J. Trump's presidency, right? So in a lot of ways, President Trump and I look at this in the same way. We want good wages for American workers. We want Americans to be able to speak their own mind in their own country. And sometimes that means you've got to take on those monopolies. President Trump already did it, and I think he'll do it again if we give him another chance.
It just stands out as interesting to me because you courted so much money effectively for the campaign from Silicon Valley and from so many of these
Not from Google and Facebook, Margaret. I think there's a big difference between big tech and little tech, right? A lot of these companies are upstarts. They're trying to build a cool product. They're trying to take on the Googles and Facebooks of the world. Google and Facebook are not giving me a whole lot of money because they don't like me, because I believe that Americans ought to be able to speak their own mind in their own country. And I think these companies are too big. We ought to take the Teddy Roosevelt approach to some of them, break them up, don't let them control what people are allowed to say. So yes, the big tech companies don't like me. The little tech companies, people I think who are trying to do something important to take on those big tech incumbents, yeah, a lot of them do support me, and I'm of course proud to have their support because we agree on a lot of big issues.
So you're promising them less regulation of certain things? Is that what
you're promising? Who?
Small tech. You didn't give any names, so I don't know
Well, look, I mean, I think Twitter, for example, if you look at its user base and you look at how much control Google has over the digital advertising infrastructure, we ought to be going after some of those incumbents. And certainly, I don't think that Elon Musk has any monopoly. He's not using his company to try to destroy competitors. And that, to me, is when something crosses the line where you've got to be a little bit more focused on antitrust issues.
And Donald Trump is going after the Justice Department. More on the $100 million lawsuit, as the former president says the government's 2022 raid on his Mar-a-Lago home was political persecution. You're streaming America Decides. Donald Trump is planning on suing the Justice Department for $100 million over the raid on Mar-a-Lago. In a memo, the former president's legal team called the August 2022 search, quote, political persecution. CBS News campaign reporter and attorney Katrina Kaufman joins us now. Katrina, good to see you. So the former president is claiming that he'll sue. Walk us through what this actually means and what happens next.
Hi, Caitlin. So essentially, this is just notice to the Department of Justice that Trump has to provide. It's not the actual lawsuit yet. And the DOJ will have 6 months to respond to this. But this is also a very unusual move. And I feel like I'm always saying this with Trump's legal stuff, but it's really unprecedented because you don't normally see this type of claim outside of a case. Usually within the criminal case itself, you would see this litigated. And in fact, it was being discussed at the final hearings for the Florida classified documents case before it was dismissed. They had a hearing on this very issue of the defense claiming that the search warrant was unconstitutional, that there were issues with it. And even now, after the case has been dismissed, they're still bringing this up, and they now want to move forward with a civil lawsuit, they're saying.
And Katrina, what major arguments is Trump's legal team making here?
Trump is saying that the Mar-a-Lago search was an invasion of his privacy. It's called intrusion of seclusion. He's also saying that this is just malicious prosecution, that there was no probable cause here. The search never should have taken place. And it is important to note, though, that this was a search that was approved by a federal judge. They discussed, they coordinated the timing with Trump's team, so they were well aware of the fact that this was going to happen. However, some of the sources I've been talking to today really say that they see this as a frivolous lawsuit, as a publicity stunt, something that Trump might not actually ultimately move forward with because it would leave him vulnerable to discovery, to a deposition, but it allows him to continue this narrative of being persecuted by these prosecutions.
And our audience will remember that that classified documents case against Donald Trump has been dismissed. And I'm curious how that case being dismissed would impact a potential lawsuit here.
Well, they're using it as part of their argument, Caitlin. They say the fact that it was dismissed shows that this was a malicious lawsuit, that it never should have happened. They say that the Department of Justice actually should have foreseen that Trump would be found immune by the Supreme Court for his official acts. And ultimately, they're asking for $100 million in punitive damages, but also for $15 million in compensatory damages to recoup all of these legal fees related to the Florida case.
Interesting to keep an eye on another legal development, and for that, we're grateful for your reporting. Katrina Kaufman, thank you. And Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass has made history at the closing ceremony of the Paris Olympics. Bass received the Olympic flag on Sunday night, making her the first ever black woman mayor to do so. Bass then handed it off to gymnast Simone Biles. However, Tom Cruise ended up stealing the show. The Mission Impossible actor ziplined onto the field from the top of the Stade de France and carried the flag out of the stadium on a motorcycle to begin its journey to Los Angeles for the 2028 Olympic Games. Well, that does it for us today. We'll be back with another edition of America Decides tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern. The Daily Report with John Dickerson starts right now.